Welcome to The Third Story. I'm Leo Sidran. Today's conversation is with Will Lee. Will is the bass player and the singer in the CBS Orchestra. That's the house band on The Late Show with David Letterman. If you've ever seen that show, then Will is a familiar fixture. But in addition, he's had a long career as a session musician and session singer. He grew up in a musical house surrounded by music that he describes as always grooving. His father, Bill Lee, was a jazz piano player and jazz educator, and his mother was a jazz singer as well. But despite the fact that he was surrounded by music as a young boy, he says that he didn't really decide to become a musician himself until he saw the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. As a session musician, he has played on countless records. And when I say countless, I mean it is easy to lose count. If you go to his website, willlee.com, and look at the discography, it's mind-boggling how many records he's played on and how many of them were hit records. In addition to that, he's had a career as a singer on records and jingles. A lot of the jingles when I was a boy, particularly Saturday morning TV, were sung by Will. He's done quite a bit of touring on top of that, and when you add it all up, it's a full and very prodigious career. I was wondering before I talked to him, how does somebody manage to fit all of that work in to one career? And when I talked to him, I realized how much energy he has and how contagious that is. And also how generous he is with his time and his spirit. He came over to my house on a Saturday evening and he brought a small potted plant as a kind of a goodwill gesture before we sat down to talk. And I think that that's a real sign of what kind of person he is. He said in our conversation, "I never paid one due because I always loved what I was doing." And he also said, "I'm excited about the project, whatever it is." You know, you feel that kind of thing when you're with him. You feel that he's sincere about it, and that real energy and generosity is transmitted, I think, in probably most of the experiences that people have with him. He was really gracious to talk to me and very enthusiastic. But, you know, he plays bass 4 nights a week in the Ed Sullivan Theater on the Late Show with Dave Letterman. That's the very same stage that the Beatles were on when he saw them on TV as a young boy and decided to surrender himself to the music. So he has some reasons to feel good. Before we get started with the conversation, I'm going to play part of one of the songs from his new record. The record is called Love, Gratitude, and Other Distractions. And the song is called Misunderstanding, which is the first song that he wrote for the project. Despite the fact that I've set him up as a session bass player and singer, on his solo records, he writes most of the songs and sings them.
God's little joke stormed in from the rain, demanding some help with her baggage. She said she was soaked, so she put my favorite robe on. All I could say was, "What's in the bags?" She said, "Never mind, I'm a star in the making. That makes me exempt from all reason." I said, "That's absurd. There are rules here to follow." She opened her bags and unpacked them. She carried old issues and a trunk full of pain. One suitcase was loaded with shame. One carry-on was carrying hurt, and the smallest compartment held hope. Misunderstanding. She's in tune with your philanthropy. Misunderstanding. Her necessity knows no boundaries. Oh, especially not yours. up to find her feet up on the table, doing my crossword in bed.
Will Lee, thank you so much for joining me today.
Leo, it's great to be here with you in your private realm.
Where are you coming from today, by the way?
I'm coming from the beautiful island of Manhattan, the island in the sea, the island between the two so-called rivers. One is actually an estuary. The Hudson is a river. The East River is an estuary because it actually goes two different ways. It doesn't just flow. It actually changes when the tide changes. But Manhattan, New York City, my home since 1971 that I love so much that I can't imagine ever settling down, so to speak, anywhere else. You know, when you get old, where are you going to retire? Well, I'm going to get a tropical island. Nah, kind of spent time in some tropical islands and know that that's not the place you want to be around the clock.
If you stay here long enough, Manhattan will become a tropical island, I think.
I think it's getting there.
You know?
I think the coral reefs are starting to creep northward toward us.
They're coming. You came here in 1971, but you are not a New Yorker by birth.
I'm from Texas originally. 1952, I was born in San Antonio. My father was always a jazz educator while being a musician. You and I have that in common. Our fathers are jazz pianists. And my father composed a lot of pieces of music for not only sort of, quintet, quartet kind of music, but also, major like choral pieces and, symphonies and things like that. Kind of contemporary, yeah.
And how did you find music?
Music was just always around, except that, being a kid and being the parents of jazz musicians. My mother was a singer, a great jazz singer, kind of in the school of Sarah Vaughan. Not well known, but she had a great voice. And she and he, my parents, influenced all of us a lot, all of us four kids. I'm the oldest of four. By just playing, records all the time. A lot of Miles, a lot of Cannonball, a lot of Nancy Wilson, a lot of Sarah. And by playing, sometimes duet. The two of them would play at parties and stuff. Dad would play piano, Mom would sing. And Dad was really playing a lot when he had free time. He would sit down by himself, left foot rocking, playing the bass line, and playing solos and chords with his right hand, like amazing, which I always thought, wow, what is that? That's incredible. And it always had a great feel. So I grew up with sort of feel, and feel was the thing that really translated to me, except that it wasn't really until the Beatles hit the Ed Sullivan Show in 1964 that I thought, maybe music is going to be my life from now on. It wasn't until that moment.
So even though you had music in the house, two musicians, you were surrounded by
beautiful set of drums for years, never touched them. Didn't really feel like I was, didn't feel the need to gravitate toward them really. And I kind of wanted to just go outside and play kid stuff.
But you do mention the kind of music that they were putting on the turntable, the Cannonball and Nancy Wilson, and had it was real pocket
always
jazz.
Grooving, yeah. And that your body remembers. Your body remembers when it comes time to actually make music. Your body remembers what that's supposed to feel like. So you're allowed to now provide the groove yourself if you can find chops on some instrument.
I read on your frequently asked questions page.
Oh yeah,
that it wasn't.
I've heard a lot about that.
It's a great page, man. You should check it out. willlee.com. It's easy to remember. That you were playing some horn also early on.
Dad thought it would be a good idea to teach his two sons how to play trumpet because my dad had been a trumpet player before he was a pianist. He had to stop playing because he got tuberculosis as a teenager. So he stopped playing trumpet, changed to piano, but he sort of thought he saw a glimmer of interest in his son's eyes to play trumpet. He was wrong. But we did anyway. We sat down. He gave us some home lessons, and that sort of got us into the basics of reading, which was enough to allow me to enter into junior high school and get into the band as a trumpet player. So I had a little bit going on there, and I was kind of always first chair, but it wasn't really that demanding. It wasn't, there was I never learned how to improvise.
On the trumpet?
I could only read. Because, I was another one of those guys who had a little bit of natural something but didn't practice. Otherwise, I probably would have been, Joe Bebop or something.
Sure. Were you playing guitar also at that age, or you were really just playing trumpet?
Just started out with just trumpet for a while. The guitar, the bass thing came in later after, kids started forming bands, kids that had been influenced by this Beatles movement, by the whole change of pop music and fashion by those four guys. Mm-hmm. When the British invasion happened, the music merchandisers had field day because they were selling all kinds of guitars and drums. And bass at the time was still a really young instrument, electric bass. And a lot of kids our age, 11 years old, did not know what to do with the bass, and they would have been just as happy to pick up a tennis racket and pretend, that kind of mentality. So if they had any guitar chops at all, that was already they were pretty standouts. But forget about finding a bass player at that age because no kids were doing that. So our band, in which I was the drummer, started to feel the need to get a more professional, if you will, sound. So we thought, okay, we got to get us a bass player. And since there was nobody around, I just said, let's get a drummer. I'll switch to bass. Okay, whatever. We got to get the sound for our band. Mm-hmm. And what a mistake. We got the drummer. I started playing bass. I was the lead singer. I didn't realize how hard it was going to be to do that and play bass. Mm-hmm. But there I was with the bass. We had a gig. The drummer's father got us the gig. We couldn't fire him.
Of course not.
He wasn't bad or anything. It was just like, I just thought, oh man, what have I done getting off the drum kit and trying to play this bass while I'm singing,
Mm-hmm.
But it was kind of too late, so we had to do the gig, and I had to really sort of shed and get it together.
So actually playing bass and singing kind of came together simultaneously for you.
Well, it's funny because every time you learn a new piece of music, playing and singing, it's like starting back at the beginning again. You got to start from either learning the bass part so that you can be free to sing, and that's really what I do. That's how I approach it. I try to like get that stuff under my fingers so that I can deliver the message of the song. Because you can't really give, 50. You can't cheat the math of giving more than more than 100% of yourself. So
right. There's only 100% to give, no matter how much we want.
So you have to figure out where you're going to economize.
I was going to ask you about your singing a little bit later, but it seems like it enters here at this young age. You were the lead singer in the band also. So At what point did you realize that you liked to sing, that you were a good singer, that you had a talent
I haven't
for it?
realized that yet. I'm still waiting for that moment to happen.
You're just going to keep singing until you realize it?
Until I bust through some level of betterness.
When your dad taught you and your brother to read and to play trumpet, was the vibe cool? Were you receptive to learning it from him?
No, we were really undisciplined kids.
Yeah.
We were playing "I Love You Truly" and laughing our way through it. We'd have more fun just singing it with fake lyrics. "I love you truly, Tom Dooley." We had no interest at all. We were just going through the motions, and it kind of made it. For me, I mean, my brother dropped out really early, but for me, it made it kind of turned into a project, something to do. So that's why I got a little bit more into it, enough to join the junior high school band. And then I kept going in through high school with trumpet. And then the high school band director talked me into switching over to French horn. And that was really tough. But it became the thing that I entered college doing as my major, was French horn.
And you went to Miami?
Yeah.
Which was close to home?
About a block away. Yeah, it was pretty easy. I loved my bedroom. I wanted to stay,
So you stayed at home that year?
Yeah. For the year and a half that I stayed in college, yeah.
And you continued your development that you had already started in high school of playing around town? And
yeah, I was doing sort of at the University of Miami, they weren't really teaching much beyond jazz and classical, so I was kind of jazzing it by day and rocking it by night. And there was, plenty of work to do. I never had a shortage of gigs.
Did you must have realized early on that being a bass player, although I guess at the very beginning you were sad to leave the drums behind, but pretty quickly I imagine you realized that being a bass player was a good path to being able to work.
It's funny. I didn't really have to make that decision. It just kept happening, and it just, it was like no fork in the road. It's just like, well, I'm going to, the next gig is next week. So, and then it became the next gig is next is the next day, and then it became the next gig is in an hour. Mm-hmm. They started getting closer and closer together. By the time I left Miami, I was in like 8 bands, a lot like the New York style of life became later.
Why did you leave Miami?
I had never thought of leaving or doing anything except continuing what I was doing. And I happened to be a huge fan of, there was a band called Dreams that I and other members of my peer group were totally focused on at the time. This is college, this is like 1970. First Dreams album came out, and it blew all of my friends away, myself included. We were just like, okay, we're the kind of guys, at least I was particularly the kind of guy who was studying jazz in the daytime and playing rock at night. So this Dreams band was the fusion between those two things that was really knocking my socks off more than anybody else. This is the time when Chicago, Blood, Sweat, and Tears and bands like that were hitting the airwaves, and we were buying all their albums. But Dreams had something that was just so beyond these bands. There was a lot more. The players were better. You know, Mike and Randy Brecker, Barry Rogers, Billy Cobham on drums. You know, and at that level of playing, if you're a musician, that's going to really get your attention, what these guys were doing, because it stood out way above everybody else's stuff, playing-wise. And there was a lot more playing. The record, the first Dreams album, featured a lot of improv and a lot of just really well-played music. So for me and my peer group, these were the next Beatles. We thought, okay, these are the next Beatles. They're that big in our lives. They're just so huge. They're so incredible that we would have parties just as using them as an excuse to get together. Hey, you want to come over and hear Dreams on my new stereo? You know, that kind of stuff. And I'd worn out several copies of that first Dreams album. But then a strange thing happened in my life. I got, while I was going to school, this is after enough time had gone by where I was failing as a student playing French horn and stuff like that, that I had decided, with the help of the associate dean of the University of Miami, to change over to bass as my major, which had never happened before. There hadn't been a bass major before,
electric bass.
before I had had this opportunity to go ahead and switch over from French horn, which I was just awful at, by the way, to electric bass. It never occurred to me. I never thought you could do it. And I was not about, classical bass playing. I had no interest in playing upright. And this opportunity came up, and it turned my life around. And then I found myself like in the A studio band at the University of Miami as a bass player. Now I'm reading charts. I'm playing with these swinging guys, great players, and under great supervision of Jerry Coker at the time. And while I'm up there grooving at class one day, a guy had been to the university to give a little talk, spoke to our arranging class, I think, and his name was Gary Campbell. He'd come down from New York City. And he and I found ourselves playing together one night in a jam at the Coconut Grove Art Festival one night, just a really loose jam. And I kind of forgot about that. But about a week later, I get this note placed on my bass amp that says, "Please call Randy Brecker, 212," this and some area code exchange that I wasn't familiar with, and it was New York. But it was so out of context that as much of a Dreams fan as I was, I couldn't put it together who Randy Brecker was, because it was just too out of my realm of my life at that time. Randy Brecker, 212, what is all this stuff? That name sounds kind of familiar, but what does that have to do with me?
Sure.
So I call up, and it's Randy Brecker from Dreams, asking me to come up and audition. This guy who had guest spoken at our college the week before went back to New York and told them about me, that I was maybe a guy they should consider auditioning because they were losing their bass player. And I just, got on the plane. When I got to New York, I got into the Dreams audition, and they put a bunch of charts in front of me, and I said, "Guys, I don't think I'm going to need to look at that." Billy Cobham counted it off, and I was just floating. It was the easiest thing I've ever had to do in my life.
They obviously knew quickly that you were hip to what they were doing.
Yeah, I'm sure they were pretty surprised about how well I knew their music.
You were the first bass electric bass major at school, so you knew that it was a kind of innovative thing that you were doing. But did you have a sense that you were on the cutting edge of something when you were in school, even at that point, that there were very few people that were doing what you were doing?
Not as much as I felt lucky to have been asked to stay in school and have them not fail me for what I had done before that, because I was really doing badly. I was missing classes. I was letting the gigs the night before take over my schedule. My first class of each day was an 8 o'clock theory class, but I had played till 4 in the morning the night before, 6 nights a week, 6 sets a night. So that was starting to get the best of me until the turnaround of me following my real interest, allowing me to make that what I could do in college be my thing that I was doing. Because before that, I was just, I wasn't relating to any of the classes really, except for a couple. Not enough to keep me in the, high grade point average, that's for sure.
But you were happy enough there. If you hadn't gotten the call to audition, you think you would have been happy to stay?
Yeah, I was doing fine. Yeah. Do 8 bands,
Some other great electric bass players came out of that program after you.
Absolutely. Well, what happened was, okay, so I happened to be the first bass major. But then a couple of year and a half or 2 after I got to New York, I started to do really good in the studio world, and I was really loving being here, and I couldn't believe what was happening. And my dad, who was the dean of the University of Miami Music School, called me up and said, I want to have the actual bass school at the University of Miami Music School, and I want you to be the head of the bass department. And I was like, Dad, man, as much as I appreciate that, I'm doing really okay in New York, and I kind of want to really stay here because things are going real nice, So who did he call? Jocko, to be the head of the bass department, since I said no. And a lot of guys that we know studied under Jocko, including Hiram Bullock, Mark Egan, Frank Gravis, another New York bass player. The funny thing is that they all have the same great story, where they would go and have their weekly or however often lesson with Jocko. They'd go into the room and Jocko would go, okay, play this groove, man. Doom, 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 goo, doo, goo, goo, doo, 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 or whatever. And then Jocko would start to solo for an hour. And then it was over. See you next week. But as awful as that sounds, that is the best lesson for a guy who thinks he wants to be a professional bass player. Sure. That's what you're going to do. You are going to be that foundation for something else to happen on top of. And those are the guys that really do the work, that get the gigs, or that's what they're doing. So even if Jocko thought he was taking advantage of guys, which I don't think that he probably did, knowing what kind of sweet guy he was, I think that, these guys really got lucky because they not only got to understand what it feels like just to support something for a long time, they got to hear Jocko play in person.
And to feel what it feels like to support something great.
Yeah, it had to be amazing. I wish those guys had taped every lesson.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody ever did.
Before I ask you about moving to New York and what it was like here, I just want to go back to that moment when you heard the Beatles the first time on Ed Sullivan. What do you remember hearing?
Well, the first thing that happened was, this was Huntsville, Texas, a really small town. And they had one radio station there, and it was called KSAM. Everything was named after Sam Houston in Huntsville, Texas. There was a Sam Houston Park and a museum and a thing and a deal. Even the college where my dad taught was Sam Houston State College. So when the record "I Want to Hold Your Hand" broke on the radio, and they were playing it, the first time that they aired it, I happened to be listening, and I didn't really know how I felt about it at first because it was just too amazing and too new and too fresh compared to all the pop music that was going on at the time, which was kind of a little bit black and white compared to this colorful new sound that came over from across the pond, which the Beatles, in their minds, they think they're doing their version of our music, which is, to me, hilarious because it was so fresh and so new sounding. But, the DJ got on and he said, man, you got to see these guys. They look just like girls. He had this whole rap, But that was probably let's say that was like December or January of 1964. And the country was pretty sad after JFK's assassination as a whole. And we really needed a bright moment, a bright light, something new to focus on, because that had been so terrible for everybody. And here come these smiling, these bright, clever, energetic, super musical, fresh approach writing, singing guys. And so by the time they got to the Ed Sullivan Show, I had already bought the album and I was familiar with the material that they had recorded so far. But to see them in person and to see the reaction by the women in the audience, that's the thing that allowed me to. First of all, I wouldn't let anybody near the TV set. I stood right next to it. I wanted every pixel of this. I had to see like every detail. I wouldn't let anybody near the TV, and I was like, "Okay, Mom, Dad, I got this. You can back off. I got this one." So I was just sitting there studying like this amazing phenomenon with the energy and the stuff, and the music and the excitement and the way they looked, so exciting. And no four guys ever looked more like they belonged together than those four guys. They just looked incredible and sounded ridiculous. And there they were. They were changing the face of the whole pop music scene and songwriting and fashion right there all at once, And as soon as the broadcast ended, I went right back to my bedroom and got on the kit. I went right to the drums and started, because now I knew what I wanted to do and how to do it, because you got to see how it was done. But most of all, you got to see the reaction, and that was the thing that really made it exciting for me. It was like, if I do this, is there any chance that I could get anywhere near that reaction? If I do it right. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to do it right.
Yeah, but you didn't necessarily tune into the bass playing as a single thing when you first saw them. It wasn't
not at the beginning. In fact, the Beatles had a sound, when they performed together on record or whatever. And for just decades, I never really thought about who was singing what. I just thought in my mind, I had this picture of this unified thing. Well, not decades, years, okay. Up until the White Album, there was just this really unified feeling coming from the records, So to me, it sort of didn't matter who was singing or anything like that. I wasn't even picturing that in my mind. I was picturing four guys like getting a thing done, and I was really impressed by that. I thought it was amazing what four guys can do. They just had this sort of Beatles sound,
And you now have a band that plays...
Absolutely.
The Fab Four that plays pretty much verbatim the arrangements.
Because the records are so magic, that what we do is we bring those records to the stage.
And how has opening up that complete picture and picking out the individual voices and colors changed the way you think about it? Has it at all, or?
Well, you get like you're over the sort of the initial fascination thing, and now you're sort of into an analytical approach to weeding out all the little details so that you can put them back together and make that thing happen again. Except now live. And this is something that probably I think is unprecedented, because if there was ever a Beatle band before us, and there have been many, they seem to be focused more on wanting to pretend to be the Beatles. And it's okay. I mean, they do their best to sound like it too, which you can do. But with four guys, you can't really get the record sound. And maybe that's not what they're going for in any way, shape, or form. And I certainly know that the Beatles themselves never tried to recreate the record. They just were doing that night's version of the song. I mean, I'm sure they were trying a little bit, but, they, with four people, knew that they couldn't really get double vocals out of four people, and they couldn't get percussion parts and extra keyboard parts out of four guys, So they just did what they did, and that's what you see the bands kind of imitating. The other Beatle bands, the look-alike, dress-alike, wigs, noses bands.
Wigs and noses, yeah. I hadn't thought about that. Sure, what you're doing is bringing the records to life.
That's exactly what we want to do. Yeah, because for me, that's where the excitement really lives, in all those great, innovative sounds. I mean, those guys were wizards. Like, they were like in the laboratory making up things that are now like expected to be on every recording. Flanging started with John Lennon wanting himself to, not compete with Paul's perfect double tracking of vocals, but ask the engineer, can you do the thing where you put your hand on the actual moving tape and make it a little wobbly so that my voice can sound like it's doubled? He did a thing. He actually coined the term flanging right there in the studio, because the engineer, Ken Scott, would put his hand on the tape flange, and make it so that John's vocal, played back, the same vocal could be messed with by him messing around with the tape and have the effect of a doubled vocal, because John really didn't want to bother, because it's a pain in the ass to do that,
I know you've had a chance to talk to and play with at least three Beatles. I don't know if you ever had a chance to talk to John.
I didn't talk to him, but I played with him on a track that he had already played on. So technically, I've played with all four Beatles.
You played with all four Beatles. That must be a fantastic feeling.
It's incredible, yeah. I mean, that's a New York thing right there. That's a reason to be in New York.
Well, yeah, okay, so let's talk about that. So you moved here because of the band audition that you got the gig.
Right.
In 1971?
71, yeah.
And what was the scene like?
Well, the scene for me and that band, Dreams, was nothing like what I had envisioned from Miami, armchair. Because when I finally got up here, thinking that I was joining the next Beatles, it was quite humbling to see what was actually going on. Because as great as the band was, and as well as everybody could improvise and all that kind of stuff, we seemed to end up in situations where we weren't necessarily the headliners, but we would open for people like Springsteen or, Peter Frampton and stuff like that. So when we got on stage, we were just the opening act, and people weren't all that interested in what we were doing, So it started to be a little bit disheartening at times, and obviously we weren't the Beatles, so we had to, do the best we could under whatever conditions we were, management would put us in, and it wasn't always like the greatest thing in the world. And, after a while, things started to sort of fizzle, because Billy Cobham had decided he was going to leave and start Mahavishnu Orchestra. Mm-hmm. And we probably knew all along, but he was the guy who was really driving the performances of the band, because he was the guy setting up like the next section, because there was a lot of improv going on. So with all this improvisation, somebody had to call the shots, and it turned out that was Billy. So we had tons of drum auditions, and as it worked out, none of the guys really ever satisfied, that Billy thing that we needed to happen from back there driving the bus. And while I had been living in New York, I did become aware of this incredible studio scene that was going on, because I'd seen some of the guys in the band doing it, Bob Mann, the Breckers themselves, Billy, talking about their exploits and, sessions and stuff. And I was actually invited to be an audience at a couple of sessions, and I just couldn't believe what a great scenario that was. You're surrounded by great players, and you're playing a piece of music that you've never played before, and will probably never have to ever think about again. And then you move on to the next scenario of a brand new, fresh room full of people,
fresh music,
never have to hear it again. It's a challenge. You make up a part, or you do whatever, and then you get some money, and then you go to the next thing. And I just thought, okay, this is something that I've never imagined seeing before. This is an amazing thing. And I never imagined myself in it, because I could see from the beginning how sewn up this whole scene was. So for me, I'd never even dreamed of it. So I just said, this is great. You guys have a really cool thing going on here. Dreams is falling apart. Okay, so now Dreams is done. I'm going back to Miami, because where I know I'll be king shit, because I have been to New York and played with Dreams, and that's a big deal to the people that I hung out with in Miami, and as it was, even before that, I was already in 8 bands anyway, so I knew I'd be able to pick up some work down there. I kind of knew that I had nothing going on in New York, so when I made that statement to some of the guys in Dreams, they said, oh, no, you're not moving to Miami. You're going to stay here in New York. We're going to put you up in our house, and we're going to get you work. And when I heard that, it was like, really? This was Bob Mann and drummer Alan Schwartzberg, by the way, that said that, and gave me that great offer to stay at their house while, in between not working and getting gigs. And sure enough, they started getting me some work.
They suggested
Yeah, they would,
people?
Bob Mann was arranging jingles and stuff, and he would get me in on a thing to come not only play but sing. And it was like, next thing I knew, I was turning into one of these guys that I'd seen from a distance, being a studio musician. And it was like, how did that happen? That was amazing, But what happens is, in any case that I got in, it was because somebody else couldn't make it, And what happens is, if you get too busy, they still need to have somebody come in. So if it's not you, it's got to be somebody else. Mm-hmm. And I was that somebody else for a while, I filled the gap for what was needed at the time. And then next thing I knew, I was becoming more and more in demand to the point where I was 5 or 8 of these sessions a day, And that was crazy for a long time.
So that's this period that I've heard about, but I was never privileged enough to see, was this really hot time.
Almost at this point, that's almost what it feels like to me too, because it's so far from what's going on now.
But it would be multiple sessions a day.
Yes, many. Sometimes just because New York is Manhattan's a small island, and all the studios were just within blocks of each other. So you could just get from one to another very quickly, and it was easy.
What do you think distinguished the first call guys back in that era? What did a good studio cat have going for him?
2 sharpened number 2 pencils. No. Actually, for me, since I had been a witness to this stuff, I had already become like a fan and an idol of guys that I really admired. So I already had a set of standards sort of ready to go. And I wanted to be able to play with a pick and get as beautiful a sound as I'd heard this guy Kirk Hamilton use when he played bass. Mm-hmm. I wanted to be able to read, and I wanted to be able to show that I wasn't going to waste anybody's time by not having it together with the reading thing. And I wanted my instrument to be in tune, and I wanted every part of it to be in tune in case I needed to use this other part of the instrument that I don't use all the time. I wanted to see if there was a way to make that part of the instrument in tune as well as everything else about the instrument. And I wanted my strings to sound fresh, and I wanted to be able to be versatile, and I wanted to be able to have a funky sound. I wanted to be able to play with my fingers, with a pick, with my thumb, whatever was needed. I kind of developed little techniques to sneak my way through all that stuff because you didn't know what you were going to have to do from minute to minute. Say you were doing a campaign for like Contact cold pills, and you had to do like the country version followed by the rock and roll version followed by the blues version followed by the polka version followed by the syrupy ballad version. So you wanted to have enough of an arsenal of sounds that would accommodate all that stuff. So I started to learn how to play, all these different techniques on the bass that would allow me to do that kind of stuff.
What bass were you playing then?
I think I was playing a Fender Precision for a long time until I lost it in a fire. And when that happened, I switched over to a Fender Jazz because I couldn't find a Precision that was nearly as good as the one that I had lost. And I'm still looking. And that was 40-something years ago. I'm still looking.
The first sessions that you were doing were mostly commercial jingle dates, or were you doing records early on too?
I was doing almost an even amount of those things, but you could actually do more jingles because they were short. I preferred records, because I just thought I was doing something a little bit more meaningful than selling something, And I still do, and I haven't done a jingle in a really long time.
But you did have a period, and I didn't know it went all the way back to the 70s, but I knew the jingles of my childhood. Many of them in the 80s and 90s, Teddy Grahams and Nerf. And
I remember those.
You were the voice of a lot of that stuff. Mm-hmm. You think there's something commercial about your voice?
Well, in the case of Teddy Grahams, I think I got that. I think I got hired as the voice of the bear because they had guys come in and audition singing an Elvis song.
Yeah.
Teddy Bear. And I think that I did a version of Elvis that was so bad that they thought, that's our guy. He doesn't sound like Elvis. Mm-hmm. We love him. Because I really didn't have it together. I thought I was doing Elvis, but when a guy with my voice tries to do Elvis, it comes out like the Teddy Graham guy. Mm-hmm. So that's what I ended up doing. The Nerf, I don't know, Nerf was like a character voice. You think of the feel and the sound of an early Saturday morning commercial, fast, high energy,
Yep.
and all that stuff, and it kind of comes naturally to be able to do that, to be able to, to know to arrive at that if you can,
It comes naturally to you.
Well, yeah, or anybody. It comes naturally to know that that's what you're aiming for, at least, and not that I always nailed it, but whenever I did, it was because I was trying to get that feel, that Saturday morning feel.
I mean, I think you're a pretty enthusiastic guy in general.
I'm excited about the project. Yes.
You show up and you're excited about it.
I think that when I'm on a gig, this is the place to be. I've always felt that way.
And that's transmitted, I'm sure.
I think it is. And it's genuine. I really do feel that way. I've been surrounded by like guys, like I would be doing like a $35 club date sort of big band where guys, had to drive like, I don't know, 11, 12 hours to Canada and make $35, and just the whole car full of guys would just be so dark and angry. And when I got there, the whole ride, I couldn't wait to get there. And when I get there, I felt like, man, I am making music with a bunch of great players, and I'm going to make it like swing like nobody's business. And this is great. This is fun. This is killing. This is the place to be.
Yeah.
I always felt that way. And so if anybody ever asked me, man, did you ever pay any dues? No, I never paid one due, ever.
Because you loved it.
All good, yeah.
I looked at your discography, which is another absolutely shockingly great page on willlee.com. One question I did have when I was looking at all of those records, there's so many classic records that you played on. Did you feel ever when something was going down in the studio, do you feel like this is really...
It's funny because you just don't know. I mean, you can be in a room with a legend, and the legend may be somebody like Liza Minnelli or Barbra Streisand or something, and sometimes they could be surrounded by 1,000 people, all there for no reason at all, having nothing to do with making this record work or better or whatever. And it could end up being like the most trite record you've been a part of. Mm-hmm. Or you could just go in and do an experimental thing. Like Chaka Khan came out with her first solo album, and I knew it was going to be a good project because Steve Ferroni was playing drums and Arif Mardin was producing, and you pull out a chart and it's "I'm Every Woman," and it's good. I mean, you don't hear the strings in the orchestration yet, but it just feels good, and you think it's got potential, but you never can tell. Mm-hmm. And for instance, I was in the studio with basically a rhythm section and Dave Matthews, the arranger, mm-hmm. and an engineer. And Dave Matthews, is just putting charts in front of us, like one after the other. And one of the tunes, they all felt good. They were all like groove-based tunes and stuff, and they had like little ideas, and then you'd play you'd fill in the blanks, But there were chord changes and stuff, and there was a form. And, one of the tunes, say, for example, was called like number 19, and you just play number 19, and you move on to the next thing. And then later on find out that number 19 was Get Up Off of That Thing, So like it's more of a happening now than it was in the studio, for example. Like, mm-hmm. Now it's like it's a classic, hit record. But at the time it was just like a groove, and yeah, it was fun, And then James came in later and put his magic on it, too. That also really made it what it was.
So when it was going down, you put everything you had into it. You played it as groovy as you could. Moved on.
You just try to get, try to remember that feel that you felt when your parents were grooving with the jazz thing, and make it feel as good as that, and then that's what it's about.
Even going back to that grooving with the parents, you have played on as many sort of jazz records as you have on really pop records.
Well, I mean, I'm limited. I'm not like a jazz giant or anything, but I am a big fan of the feel of like bebop and those kinds of grooves, and I also love any other kind of jazz that happens, whether you would call it smooth jazz or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I guess the challenge and the whole idea of what you should do when you're in that situation is just try to make it feel as good as it wants to feel. Not necessarily change it, but just make it the best it can be, whatever it is, sort of, in a producer kind of way,
What do you think the role of the producer is, or the contribution of the producer. You worked with as many great producers as you have great artists.
Well, that is, the producer needs to oversee the whole thing. He has to get above the band and look down, like what I think any musician should do, and see how the pieces are all gelling and stuff. But the bottom line is, if you're producing an artist, I think that your job is basically just to make that artist be the best that artist can be, and that's really the best you can do. Mm-hmm. You could see the potential, what the artist could be, not try to turn that artist into something else necessarily, unless that artist is just so gaga about money, that's all they care about, and then you do the formula thing, and then you get $1 million and you hate your audience because you don't respect them and all that other kind of stuff. But you get the artist who you find out what direction that artist wants to be in, and you try to shape it. You try to shape it to help that artist really. You sort of, read the mind of the artist. You stay close, in contact. You get feedback. You ask questions. You listen carefully. And I learned a lot from Arif Mardin, because I had done 26 different album projects with him. So I spent a lot of time with him in the studio, and I saw that the music is the boss, right? So whatever you can do to get to that music, mm-hmm. That's the gig for a musician or a producer, really, or anybody who's part of the project. That includes the engineer and everybody else who walks in the room and tries, is not taking energy away from the project, not hangers-oners, because those people are not really helping anything. Mm-hmm. But the people that are making the music and doing, get involved in it, just need to, always remember that the music is the boss, and it's great to have a good time and stuff, as long as that great time somehow adds into the music, if possible. My brother and I snuck down to Electric Lady one time when Stevie Wonder was doing a vocal on Talking Book. Mm-hmm. And I think the song was, baby done made some other place with another man. I think it was that song. Was that from Talking Book? If it was a song like that had a long fade, and we sat there watching Stevie improvise an outro vocally. The track was done, and he was in there just wailing over the track. And I saw the people inside the room, when he'd come into the control room, there was a lot of people in there just saying some negative stuff and pulling away from the energy and just being there for reasons other than musical. And I watched Stevie do something that was the most amazing turnaround of events. He goes in there and kind of sponges up all the stuff that's going on in the room, goes back out in the studio, and whether I thought it was part of the music or negative or pulling away or had nothing to do with it or distracting or whatever, he went in and used all that information in his ad-libs. I could see that happening. I witnessed that. I'm sure that that's what happened. And it was amazing to watch that, because he gleaned all the little stuff that was happening and somehow managed to translate that into music when he went back in the room to sing. So that was pretty cool.
So that's a memorable session that you weren't on.
Yeah. I was just a fly on the wall, man. I was happy to be there.
It's kind of funny that you've played on thousands of sessions, and that's a story that you remember and wasn't a gig that you were on.
That was pretty amazing.
Are there any sessions that really do stand out to you as memorable, as you feeling like, boy, I'm really doing something here?
Yeah, all of them, because wherever I was the place to be. No, but there was a Phoebe Snow record that we went in and just Don Grolink and I played on this track with Phoebe one time. I think it was called "There's a Boat That's Leaving Soon for New York," from the Second Childhood album, her Second Childhood album. And we went in, and there was a chart put in front of us, and it was that tune, and we just played, the two of us. And it was real intimate between the two of us, but it felt really good. It felt so good that they were able to put a whole big band on top of our track, drums, the whole bit. And it felt like we were all playing together. Now, that was the magic of, thank you, Les Paul, the multi-tracking.
Did you ever consider L.A.?
I had many invitations to move out there, and luckily I had the excuse to tell the guys that were inviting me, especially Toto, when they were first forming. They were trying to get me to come and join this new band that I remember I was getting a lot of phone calls from Jeff Porcaro and Steve Lukather. Hey, man, you got to come out. We're going to start this band, And I was, able to have the excuse that I was doing so well in the city, gave the same reason that I gave to my dad for not moving away from this developing, really hugely flourishing, in fact, thing that was happening in the city. I did a lot of records out in L.A. Had a lot of fun doing really fun stuff. Barry Manilow records, Cher records, a lot of Japanese things. Arif used to like working out there too, so he would find a budget to get me out there. And, there was never anything other than like pure admiration, back and forth between the cats in L.A. and New York.
Was there a different energy, different vibe, or
totally different? It was so different. Like the New York guys, they gotta do something with an edge. They gotta do something that hasn't been done before. They gotta outdo the next guy, the guy before them. The L.A. guys, I once watched a guy take a screaming guitar solo in one of the Manilow records that we did, sitting just like this with his legs crossed and his guitar in his hand and a huge rack of gear behind him. And he just sat there like he was in his living room, and he just wailed. In New York, a guy would have been standing on a ladder doing it, because that's what it would have taken him to get to that energy level. But this guy, it was just, that's the L.A. thing. It was so laid back compared to here. And I don't know if these guys were really laid back internally, but they sure looked like it from the outside,
So in addition to the fact that you have one of the most impressive discographies I think anybody can have, you, for the last 30 years, have done it with a kind of day job.
That's true for these last 30 years, yeah. There's been the Letterman show always going on. And, some producers would have patience for a guy who leaves in the middle of the session to go do something for 3 hours and then come back, and Arif was great about that. Arif Mardin was really patient about that for a few years. But finally he got fed up with it, because a lot of times the real energy could be happening right during that time slot, and guys don't want to just stop the works for one guy, it's silly. So, you do what you can with what you got, with the time that you have.
How did you come to be a member of the world's most dangerous band?
Well, there was a band that was really successful in Japan that I was part of. It was called the 24th Street Band, and it had Hiram Bullock, Steve Jordan, and Clifford Carter, and myself. It was a really cool band. We had a lot of fun playing. Most of the material was written by Clifford Carter and Hiram. Paul Schaefer was not only somebody that I've always really gotten along with and loved a lot as a person and musically, but he knew all of us knuckleheads, from various sessions and stuff. In fact, within the 24th Street Band realm, he produced our second album with us, so we were all really close. And at some point, the 24th Street Band was falling apart right about the time that Schaefer was getting an offer to be the musical director on this new pilot, comedy/talk show/music show pilot that was going to last for 13 weeks, guaranteed. And then he asked me, he said, I've just had this meeting with this guy, Dave Letterman, and he wants me to be the MD of his band, and I have this idea, and this had never happened before. He said, I have this idea to do instrumental Motown, Beatles, James Brown, and Rolling Stones stuff as the music for the show. And I thought, man, that sounds like fun. And he says, I want you and Hiram and Steve Jordan, to be the rest of the band besides myself. And I said, that sounds great. When does it start? And he goes, next week. And I said, shit, man, let's go in and, let's have a rehearsal. Let's learn some tunes, And I was a drug addict at the time, by the way. I want to mention that I've been sober, for a long time. But before that, I was, kind of really dependent, or I thought I was, on alcohol and cocaine. I was really a bad drug guy. It was really, I'm so lucky to be alive. So what did I do? I called my dealer right away. I said, 13 weeks of solid work, man. I've never had anything like that before. This is amazing. Just back the truck up to my door and unload everything. And then the next thing I knew, this 13-week pilot had turned into we got renewed for a little bit longer contract now. And it's like, wow, this is feeling like it's picking up momentum. Like all the college kids were starting to watch the show, and the ratings were getting big. And it was a show that started at 12:30 at night, so it was late. And the big sponsors started coming in, Budweiser, the cars and the big advertisers started coming in. It was like, wow, this is full throttle. This is amazing. By the third year, it was like, I couldn't believe it lasted this long. And that, and now it's, as we're speaking, it's 32 years. This is our 32nd year of doing it. So who knows how long it could go for. I mean, there's certainly some world records in there as far as having a steady gig on a night, a late night talk show goes.
And you've built the sort of routine of the show into your life.
Yeah, I mean, when it ends, I'll be thankful that it ended, because it's the kind of thing where I've had many chances to go do other things that I couldn't do because I was stuck doing the show, if you want to call it stuck. But when it ends, that's the only reason that I'll ever leave that, because it's just too great for a musician to have a steady gig like that.
I didn't know that you were an addict, but you do strike me as somebody who has so much energy and so much positivity and is always up and awake. What did the drugs do? Did you feel reliant on them?
Well, I had a lot of work to do growing up wise, and I really didn't do the work until I went to rehab and went to meetings and went to shrinks and stuff like that. The growing up that I had avoided, the pain that I had avoided, I had to deal with, just like anybody else has to deal with, because I think it starts in your teen years where, like, you're in high school, you're surrounded by assholes, self-loathing, and their job is to make you feel as bad as possible, because they're not digging themselves necessarily, and they're unsure, and they're growing up, and growing, it's hard to do, and it's painful. So rather than actually deal with all that pain, you either deal or you don't deal, and I was not ready to deal, so I started to medicate. I discovered alcohol. I discovered the beauty of drugs. At least that's what I was thinking at the time. And if I had drugs in my pocket, I felt like I was cool, because that's how insecure I was. It sort of took the place of actually having a real foundation for myself that would keep me from doing that. So instead of really developing myself, I just took the easy way out and did that, which was, not too cool. It was really bad for me for a while.
Did you think it had any impact on your career? Did it negatively impact your career?
It eventually had a really bad effect on my career. Yeah. I was eventually missing sessions, big sessions where I was the solo voice of a commercial, like three in one day, I think, a position that anybody would die to be in, And there I was in the position, but I would pretend I wasn't home when the phone started to ring, because I was just too wasted. But what's really funny about what you just said is, like, so when you're that out of it, and people come to see you play, and you're playing a live gig, you're at that point you're like, you become like really sort of still, and like you're like a shoegazer sort of, and people think, wow, man, he's really into it, or whatever they're thinking. But when I got sober, I was so excited to be alive and so excited about the music. All of a sudden, everything went from black and white to color. Like now, music is just like a wonderland, because before, when I was getting high, everything was like, well, okay, I'm going to try to get this done as fast as possible to get the hell out of here, And then when you got like sober, when I got sober and started to play music live, first it was scary because I was like an open wound, to the world, because my feelings were all of a sudden I was in touch with them, and it was like, holy crap, can I deal with this? And then it just got to be so much fun to play that's when people, for the first time in my life, were asking me after a gig, wow, man, I was watching you play. You must be really high on drugs, because you're so into it and your energy is so crazy. You got any? No, man, I don't have any. That's why I'm so excited to play, because I'm not hiding anymore.
I saw a photo on Facebook. Somebody posted of you walking the bar.
That might have not been a bar. That could have been an actual balcony.
But your comment on Facebook was funny, because you said, well, I was putting my life in danger regularly back then.
Hiram Bullock and I got a hold of like some of the very first wirelesses that were ever made, wireless systems for guitar players. And this is back in like 1979 maybe, or something like that. And we got a hold of these wirelesses, and we were gone. This is before in-ear monitors. So we'd go out in the audience, and the drums are like 3 days away from where you're playing, so you got to anticipate all your notes while you're out in the audience. But you leave the stage, and you're in this big, like, concrete kind of auditorium, and we would do stuff that, you know, we were rock and roll. You know, we were just at this energy place where you didn't care. You know, you left the audience, you found your way all the way up to the second floor, the balcony, and now the thing that that the audience would lean on, you were going to, like, walk across that thing, and it's about, you know, 6 or 8 inches wide.
Balance beam, kind of.
Just exactly about the size of a balance beam, yeah. And the only thing below you is a concrete floor and chair backs, you know, the backs of the audience's seats. And if anything happened, that's where you were going to end up, like on your ass. So what would happen was you didn't think about that stuff when you were up there entertaining, because you just wanted to, because you were in the moment. It was like, yeah, man, you know, and you were balancing on that beam. So you wouldn't think about it until about 4 o'clock in the morning. I would wake up, oh my God, did I do that? You know? And by then it was too late, of course. But luckily, nothing ever really happened. We took, you know, a lot of chances.
How do you approach the TV show at this point? You're only on screen for maybe a couple minutes a night, but it's a huge platform every night. You have to be in show business every night.
As a singer, I've gotten really serious about my vocalizing lately, and I have a vocal coach, and I work really hard on my voice every day. Really kind of got a discipline going with that. And because that gig has become a real vocal thing for us now. We sing all the time. And what you don't see is, like, when there's a long commercial break while the band is playing, they just might decide to have a meeting at Dave's desk during that time. And it could be endless. And I could be singing a Chicago song at the top of my range for that whole time.
So you have to stay strong. You have to be ready.
Yeah.
How does the arranging work for the band? Who chooses the tunes and who puts the arrangements together?
Over the years, we've sort of started out by just kind of jamming stuff, and then we started to have more formal rehearsals. And when you have a horn section, of course, you have to really do some arranging. Otherwise, all 3 horn players will go for the same note, and you won't have a section anymore. You just have a bunch of soloists. We have outside rehearsals, and, you know, before we go into an outside rehearsal, Paul will come to us and say, is there anything that you really want to sing? Is there a song that you feel like you really want to do? You know, and we'll just bring in a tune or two. And there's, you know, Paul sings, Felicia sings, and I sing, basically. You know, we try to think of something that we haven't sung that we could be singing.
Paul's actually very clever about choosing tunes for guests when they come out, little inside nods to who they are. Is that Paul? Is it a collaborative thing?
We all talk about it, yeah.
It's hip. It's like a little inside thing. If you know what's going on, then you get it.
It could be fun, yeah.
You, having played on so many records with so many producers and supported so many great artists, are also an artist in your own right. And I want to talk a little bit about your new record. Conceptually, before you started making this record, was there anything that you knew you wanted it to be?
This album, called Love, Gratitude, and Other Distractions, is totally just a collection of little stories, of little journeys. It started out unintentionally with the urge to finish and record a song that I had written. It's a song called Misunderstanding, and it was a real autobiographical song. And I recorded the tune, and once it was done, I had no plans of doing an album yet. I had just thought, okay, this is a good song, and I really would like it to be heard, so I'm just going to put it on iTunes as a thing, as a single, and, you know, whatever, which would be fine, you know, because nobody listens to albums anyway, so who cares? But then I had this other crazy idea to record an instrumental version of Smile as a bass instrumental, where the bass plays the melody. And I thought, you know, I'll get Chuck Loeb to come in, and we'll just record it live as a duet and see what it sounds like. And I was really happy with that, too. You know, I'd really gotten Misunderstanding to be where I wanted it, and then Smile became a thing that I was really happy about. And then I looked at these 2 songs side by side, and I said, well, they absolutely have nothing to do with each other whatsoever. So let me do an album based on that. So I thought, well, you know what? I have all these amazingly diverse sort of ideas that really have nothing to do with each other, except that each one is a sort of statement. Why don't I just unapologetically put together these things into an album and think of it as like greatest hits or something, you know, instead of like having to be a concept, you know. And it's really like an ADD trip through, you know, through a couple of musical feels. And it's all stuff that I really like a lot, you know, and they may not have anything to do with each other. One song is kind of a Tom Petty-ish vibe. Another song is kind of a purely fusion-y, jazz, sort of like instrumental vibe. Another song is, you know, a cover of 1, 2, 3, done like a really beautifully slow, sexy ballad. And all the songs are just disconnected in that way. But every time I would play any collection of any combination of these for anybody, they would all say, but I do feel a thread in there somehow. There's something in there that's you that I feel, that it's enough of a thread. And don't worry about, you know, whether they fit together or not. So really the only challenge I had, but at the end, is the same challenge I had making any album that I've ever been a producer on or my own solo record. And that is the sequencing of the songs. You know, that really, it's funny how that changes the shape of each song, especially if you're listening to it as a whole or anything back to back, you know, in any part of an album, you know.
It's interesting that you mention the song Smile and also the importance of sequencing, because I loved that you closed the record with Smile.
I always knew I was going to.
In terms of sequencing, also, you open the record by saying, born into a world of change. Is that an autobiographical song as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the whole song, its gratitude is really based on the whole 12-step program, and it's based on just the difficulty and the challenge of life and relationships with yourself and other, you know, people that you love and care about having relationships with.
You paraphrase in the lyric at one point, the give me the strength to accept the things I cannot change.
The Serenity Prayer is built right into the song in a paraphrased way, yeah.
It felt, when I heard that, I thought, this is personal. This record is going to be more, maybe a little more personal. These songs are really personal.
Definitely.
How do you go about deciding who to call for what tune, how to put it together?
Well, the music is the boss, as I said before. The music tells you just what to do. And as much as I would like to be thought of as a Swiss Army knife of a guy, you know, I've always loved that the jazz players thought I was a rock guy and the rock players thought I was a jazz guy. That's the kind of world I want to be in, where nobody's pigeonholing me, so to speak, except when it comes to having a Beatles band. That was the exception to the rule. But throughout my career, I've always loved to not be thought of as this guy or that guy. He only does this or he only does that. But in the meantime, I've been so guilty of doing that to everybody that plays that I know. And I have, in my mind, I feel like a certain guy is really going to be great at this particular thing. And there's sort of nothing wrong with that, you know, because it actually, if you zero in on somebody's essence and really think that, or at least your idea of it, I could be really wrong about it, because there's always way more than meets the ear to a musician. Mm-hmm. But, you know, I love certain aspects of a person's playing, and I just kind of wanted to incorporate what I loved a lot about a person's playing, you know, into the songs where I thought that were really calling for that person and their talent. When you go, like you're going to go to Japan at the end of the year with your band, how do you decide on what the touring band is, because you have so many people on the record? Well, I kind of thought I wanted it to be a little bit like, you know, different nationalities and stuff. I kind of thought it would be great to have like a woman or two and some of my African American friends and blah blah blah. But it's down to 5 people. It's got to be 5 people. So the more I've thought about, you know, who I was surrounded with that I could really get an instant rapport with right now, it turned out to be Steve Gadd, Chuck Loeb, Ali Rockberger, and Giulio Carmassi. It seemed like that way I could fill in all the blanks that I need to be filled in with enough vocal stuff and enough horn playing from Giulio and blah, blah, blah. And sure enough, Steve Gadd was available. And this band became the first version of Will Lee's Family, you know, and I'm sure it's going to be a rotating chair, but for now, been able to get that band together for 2 years in a row. Mm-hmm. So we're going back. And, you know, the hardest thing for me is what to do, what to play, what to sing on stage, what to fill up the that hour and change time slot with what songs, what do I not do? You know, because I got a lot of choices. So in my mind, I thought it might be important to sort of think of it in terms of not only, you know, getting the new record played live, but also to try to see if I can think about what is in my past that people might want to hear. So there's some 24th Street Band stuff in there because in Japan we were so big that it gets people really excited to hear that stuff. So I got to put some 24th Street Band in there. And, you know, stuff from my first record ended up being on the thing, and I think some stuff from Brecker Brothers albums that kind of have a good, you know, that come off well live. That seemed to work pretty well. And I wanted to make Steve Gadd happy too, so I had to put a shuffle in there because he can just shuffle all night long. Tried to be like, to think of it almost like the album in a way too. It shows off a little bit of the playing, bass playing, soloistic kind of stuff too.
There are so many great players on the record, and sadly, some of them passed before the record came out. Yes,
that's the problem with taking too many years to do a record, which I did take, you know, a good couple of years to do it. And the first track, there are 3 people on the first track that are no longer with us. The first track that we recorded, which is to me so strange, you know. It's just so bizarre how that happened. The first person that we lost was Larry Hoppin, who sang backgrounds on Misunderstanding.
And Hugh.
And then we lost Hugh McCracken along the way, which was really a devastating thing because, you know, Hugh McCracken, ever since I've been in New York, he's just like this guy who, in spite of what I said earlier about how to have a successful career as a studio musician, he did the opposite. You know, he would show up late as he wanted to sessions. In fact, his whole life he was known as the late Hugh McCracken.
I didn't know that.
That's one of his many nicknames. Human Cracker. In fact, I introduced my wife Sandrine to him as Human Cracker, and she actually thought his name was Human for the first few years of knowing him, which is cute because she's from France and she wasn't really in on the joke. So he's just like, and these people, you know, I did lots of sessions with these guys. Hugh, we were friends forever. And like Hiram Bullock, Hugh and Richard T. as well, these are guys who will never die, in my mind. Hiram Bullock, these guys, they're still as alive as can be and still inside of me, and I'm just still doing my best to just keep going with the continuation of the groove that we all started together. You know, it's that kind of a feeling. They're always in me, and I'm always thinking about them, and I'm always like playing as if they were part of the scene, you know. And losing Chrissy Amphlett, too, who was such a close, dear friend of mine and my wife's. You know, ever since we met her, we've loved her. She came over from Australia to be married to Charlie Drayton, the drummer. And she's a huge megastar in Australia. You know, she was the lead singer of the Divinyls. And she came up at a time, if you ever have the desire to look up any of YouTube stuff of the Divinyls, you can see why she was so big there. What you can't see is why she wasn't so big in America, which is hilarious because she started a whole thing with her stage persona that since then many people have taken and taken to the bank, you know. But she was really the cutting edge female lead singer who was totally disrespectful, you know, and totally the bad girl with a sense of humor about it.
And she sings on your record, she sings this line. It's funny when I hear her, the reason I looked it up is because she says the word touch. She says, hold me, touch me. And her hit here was I touch myself.
Yeah.
So when I heard her say that, which I just thought, who is that? That's a familiar voice. I didn't know who it was. And then I thought, that's kind of almost a callback to her hit, the fact that she says touch me.
That's a total coincidence because the song was written before I ever had the idea of her playing the part. I used to sing it myself. What I tried to do at the end of that song was I tried to forgive the person that put me through so much trouble throughout the rest of that song and in real life when it happened. And in my mind, I pictured her as a person who was really trying to say, touch me, hold me, and love me, but was so bad at it that it just came out all wrong, you know. And yeah, it's very autobiographical and it is very personal. And I think that the feeling of actually, you know, doing songwriting, they're always riding this fine line of like, okay, you want to say something, you have something to say, as everybody does, but you want it to be musical. And you don't want it to be so, the words are face value and every word means exactly what it is. It's not exactly a conversation. It's got to be a little bit poetic, and it's got to be a little bit like art. Mm-hmm. And the danger of that can be losing what you're trying to say and trying to make it not only fit the music and the amount of syllables you have to play with. It's assuming the music is written first, which in a lot of cases it was in that song in particular. You're always riding the line of like, okay, I don't want the feeling to go away. I still want the feeling to be felt, even if I have to fudge the words, to get in, to fit into this slot over here. And it's been a great challenge. And that's that muscle. They talk about songwriting muscles. You have to keep that muscle in shape. And I feel like right now it's in shape, and I could really start the next record tomorrow if I had the time. I'd be ready to develop some of the other older ideas that I've been, just exploding in my brain for way too long. But in the words of John Lennon, tell the truth and make it rhyme. That's the whole art form right there. It's just trying to do that.
Well, man, thank you for telling the truth to me today. Where are you going now?
I'm going to probably go down to Lupe's East LA kitchen and try to get some Mexican food.
Dig it.
Yeah.
Will Lee, thank you so much.
Thanks, man. Thank you, Leo. Love you.